Hi, I'm Marina Hayrapetyan, Senior Manager of Product at Walmart Global Tech, member of 21 Women in Product Content Selection Committee, and Women in Product Chapter Lead in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the Spotlight Your Skills stage. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment and thank our sponsors. Without them, this event would not be possible. During this session, Building Domain Expertise, we have a great speaker and a panel of accomplished product leaders. First on stage, we have Mallika Gargeya. Mallika is a data scientist at Autodesk who thrives in the intersection of data and product management to deliver an improved customer experience. She will be sharing her experience and expertise with you during her presentation. So, you want to be a data PM?
Hi everyone, good afternoon, and welcome to my home and office as of 2020. My name is Mallika Gargeya, and I'm a data scientist hybrid product manager at Autodesk under e-commerce and customer empowerment. Basically, my team builds machine learning products, more generally data products that integrate into our online platforms to improve the Autodesk customer experience. More and more products these days leverage data to provide personalized experiences to customers. I found through my experience as a data scientist and then on the product side of things that managing the development of such products requires understanding how to build a successful data product and accepting all of the uncertainty and experimentation that comes with it. So first, let's take a step back and wipe away all of the magic words. What is AI or ML? Artificial intelligence is any technique that allows computers to mimic human intelligence. This could be using logic, if-then rules, or maybe something a little more complex, like machine learning. Machine learning is a subset of AI that uses statistical methods to improve at tasks with experience. So in essence, this is a technique utilizing log data of past experiences, like button clicks, movies watched, ratings, etc., to improve at something. Machine learning uses data to learn. Deep learning is a subset of machine learning that uses multi-layered neural networks for machine learning. This subset is meant to emulate the way a human brain functions by exposing neural networks to vast amounts of data. Now, I wouldn't get too caught up in the details of implementation because that's the job of a data scientist. But it's important to note that these techniques utilize vast amounts of data to continuously learn and improve at a task. Now, if you've heard of natural language processing or computer vision, these are both techniques that fall under artificial intelligence and have to do with the type of data that you're working with. Natural language processing is used in products like Alexa or Siri and uses text data to understand and respond to text input. Whereas in computer vision, the data used would be more like image data to maybe identify a face or a car or an animal. So as you can see, all of these terms fall under this umbrella of artificial intelligence. And data science is the scientific and experimental approach using any of these techniques to derive insights from data. So you can have a data scientist who uses machine learning techniques to predict a certain outcome, or someone who's working on a computer vision project to identify from photos whether a passenger is wearing a seatbelt or not. Now that we have an understanding of these different terms, what is data product development? Or what is unique about it? According to a report by VentureBeat, 90% of machine learning models never make it to production. Why is that? The simple answer is that there's a lot of uncertainty in data science, and there are unknown unknowns. So the development of a machine learning model is more of an experiment rather than a final product. Each machine learning model that's built is often used to understand and tweak the next iteration with different data or stepping back and reframing the use case. This part is critical for understanding how product management for these types of products is different. Take an example we worked on last year. Autodesk introduced a new verification process for students using our software. A third-party company was handling the verification, and as a result, Autodesk agents were not the people to answer some of these questions, but had to redirect those cases and say, hey, you need to talk to them. The process change caused a spike in inputs coming through our virtual agent called Ava, as well as in case volume, because there were lots of confused students. Keep in mind, this new verification process had multiple different steps. So the problems didn't all get communicated in the same ways. And overall, there was a high variance in the type of language used to describe their issues. So we wanted to build a classifier that could determine from an input whether the request was related to this verification process or not, in order to redirect those requests without needing an agent to. This is what a deployed system looks like. There's a model sitting in inference mode on an endpoint. So that's a lot of words. Breaking it down, in the end product, whenever a user inputs a text, we get a label on the back end with a confidence score to determine the type of request it is, to see whether it's verification related or not. And based on that back end response, we can make a distinction about what to do with it and how to respond. And the system that runs behind that is the training infrastructure with a labeled data set. You'll hear me say this a few times in this talk, because I know we're talking about data product management, but data really is at the center of all of these products and is usually where you start. Because in order to get to this step, we needed to consider, do we have the data to build something like this where we can identify verification requests? That means we'd be looking at a class of all requests relating to verification and a negative class of all other types of requests in order for a model to understand the difference between the two. To keep the scope manageable, we kept this model focused on verification versus all other education requests. If we were classifying these requests across all requests received by Autodesk, we may not have a very strong classification. So when jumping into any problem, the first consideration is always data. Whether the data is ethical to use, whether it's biased. And in this case, we were like, we need to make sure this data isn't biased towards speakers whose first language is English. So how do we get here? How do we get from the problem statement to a solution ready for deployment? This is what I've identified to be the data product development lifecycle, an engagement process with stakeholders. The first step is to identify a problem, bring in the relevant stakeholders, and assess business value. Next, work with subject matter experts to gather relevant data and understand it. This is a very important part. This is where data scientists usually perform exploratory data analysis to figure out what all is available, what data needs to be cleaned, and if there's enough to solve the problem you're hoping to solve. Next, we need to plan the experiments to yield objective and valid conclusions. This could be filling out an empathy map with stakeholders or end users, because now that you know what's possible, we need to start and brainstorm and prioritize experiments that could solve the problem you've identified. Personally, I've also found this to be a good step for the PM to stay in the loop with the experiments. If you oversee or help with labeling tasks of a dataset, you'll understand how that classification is happening, what data is being used, and what hypothesis is being tested. Next, perform the experiment and measure outcomes to inform a decision to move forward. This will be an iterative process. So this is the stage where the machine learning model that's developed may fail, and it may perform badly. But failure here is a great lesson. This can be like, hey, we need to get more data. Or, hey, this doesn't perform well across all users, but does well only with this subset of users, like in the previous use case. In some cases, it can also be like, this data is not helpful in solving the specific problem we wanted to solve. So let's end here and refocus on the next experiment. Now, if our model is performing well and has gone through iterations of improvement to be ready for production, this last step is where UX input is taken into account and the model is deployed to production with a feedback loop for continuous improvement. The difference here between software and data product development is that we can't move the model to production and then forget about it. We need to continuously track its performance and continue to improve as it infers more about our customer. This feedback loop concept is really, really important, specifically in this space, when we need validation that a model is working as intended. Let me give you an example. In the case of a recommendation system like a Netflix recommendation, if you as a customer click on a top recommended movie and watch all the way through, that is an indication to them that they got the recommendation right. And that in turn can help inform model improvement so that they can continue to understand and tailor to your likes and dislikes in the future. Now, as you may have seen, the development process we just went over involves more than just a PM, engineers, and data scientists. Product managers are responsible for understanding the end customer's needs, managing the expectations of stakeholders, and delivering an impactful solution. In this context, the role of the product manager is also acting as the glue between the end customer, the stakeholders outside of the development process, and the data science and engineering teams. The ideal team in this case, when building machine learning models, must be interdisciplinary for the best results. You need the subject matter expert for domain expertise of the data. You need the data science and engineering team to gather data, build the model, test, and iterate. The UX designer to help deliver the machine learning model in a digestible way to the customer. The engineering team to help with deployment, and finally an analyst to track how models are doing in production. This complete process with everyone involved may seem tedious, but that 90% makes sense. That's why 90% never make it to production. But how can anything move forward if we're always iterating? The structure looks a little bit different in teams like this. Normally, a product manager is associated with one specific product and defines metrics and manages development for that one product. A data product manager is associated with a portfolio of projects, still defining the problem and the metrics to improve upon, but now experimenting to find the best solution, which can then maybe fit into several products. I'll give you an example of this. My team developed a skills model that takes a case or a chat input and determines what team should deal with it. Technical support, installation and licensing, order support, and so on. The skills model is deployed on the Ava platform and is also deployed behind Autodesk Knowledge Network, which is an online self-help article and case creation site. And we experimented with using it to identify misrouted cases in agent case queues to make sure none of the agents were wasting their time. So these data products that you develop can in fact be used across multiple platforms and use cases when developed well. As I transitioned into a product manager type role in this space, I created and used this development framework, but there were some challenges specifically when managing these types of products. How do you plan? How do you build roadmaps? And what are things to keep in mind as you develop these types of products? Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that building machine learning products is interdisciplinary. It's very important to involve domain experts and think about the data from day one. What data is available to us? What are the possibilities? Next is own the problem, not the solution. The reason you build an interdisciplinary team is so that in a room with data scientists, engineers, domain experts, and analysts, you are the person clearly defining the problem and the specific metrics to be improved. Then when it comes to solutioning, you allow the flexibility for experimentation to reach the best result. The third one is a common one. You may not need to AI or ML every problem. A common misconception is that you can wave this magic wand of machine learning and land on invaluable insights. But the reality is, the experimentation piece is only necessary in situations where there is more complexity, like high variance in language, or taking into account similar users and their behavior to make a prediction on this situation. But if personalization for your use case looks like a user bought this in the past and now they're clicking this, so we're going to show them this. So long as all of those rules are driven by data to achieve an expected outcome, that is still a data product. Finally, we've talked a lot today about the data product development process and how we get from a problem to an impactful solution. So the key takeaway I'd like to leave you all with is that it's natural as a product manager to want to time box steps and set goals and timelines. Communication will always be a big part of a product manager's job. In this space, the most exciting part of the job is accepting the experimental approach to product development and communicating meaningful milestones as you build a great product. Thank you so much for attending this talk, and I hope I inspired some of you to explore this uncertain but very rewarding area in product management. Thank you.
Thank you, Mallika. Next, we have a panel of product leaders who will be sharing their lessons from going global, launching internationally. Please join me to welcoming on stage Dr. Mave Houston, who is a Senior Director and Global Head of UX Research for Disney Plus and Hulu. Mave believes that people find something magical in themselves when consuming stories that reflect relevance to their lives. Susana Soares is the Director of International User Experience Design for Disney Plus, where she leads a multidisciplinary, globally minded design team in creating inclusive experiences. Prior to Disney Plus, she was the Director of Product Design at iHeartRadio and started her UX career at AOL. Connie Lee is the Director of Global Content Operations Strategy for Disney Plus, where she leads territorial launches for Disney Plus for the content supply chain. Connie has 13 years of experience doing the same at Netflix. She's passionate about mentoring women who are earlier in their own careers. And our moderator, Rebekah Mueller, the Senior Director of Product across Disney Plus, ESPN Plus, Hulu, and Star Plus. She manages a group of multifunctional teams focused across global expansion, internationalization, and localization. Rebekah is dedicated to improving representation across the industry and has founded Women in Technology organizations. She's also a founding member of Chief, a network focused on improving representation in executive and C-suite roles. And now I'll hand it over to Rebekah.
Thanks everyone for joining our panel today. We're really excited to share some information with you about launching internationally. So with that, I'm going to kick it off. Mave, you get the first question. I'm wondering when planning for UX research, right? That's usually an early effort. When planning for UX research for an upcoming country or regional launch, what are the key principles your team lives by?
That's a great question. The key principles, the first two are empathy and inclusion. Disney has such a strong brand across the world, and we want all of our viewers to feel like they can see parts of themselves in our stories and easily find and interact with those stories on Disney Plus. So that means we approach our research with an open and empathetic mindset so that we can truly understand our viewers, their cultural norms, rituals, behaviors, and understand how they live and what they really truly care about. And, how do they see the world and themselves, together? We don't want to assume that our experiences are the same as their experiences. So we make sure to throw out our assumptions about people and let them tell us their stories and experiences in our research studies. people have specific desired outcomes, like they have goals, right? They have needs when they watch streaming content. They watch for a reason. Some people watch to feel motivated. Some people want to laugh. Some people want to feel comforted with a happily ever after story that makes them feel like there's some sense of order, especially in really difficult times like today. And some people just want to watch something they've already seen because it's relaxing. You know how it's going to end. You don't have any stress or anxiety. So we structure our research kind of like an archaeological dig to uncover those needs and desires that people have, because that's what leads us to innovation when we know we don't have a solution for those needs, or when we know we need to retool something. But our ultimate goal is to create an experience that feels personal to everybody, like it was made for them, rather than something that they have to contort themselves to use because it was made without their needs and their goals in mind.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And it reminds me, for Susana, oftentimes, since we work across the suite of Disney streaming products, right? Some of them are domestic, some of them are global, some of them are international only. In your opinion, for international markets, compared to when, say, you're designing for a domestic product, do you take a different approach? If so, like what is that?
Sure. No, another really great question. And I would say that generally the approach when designing for either a domestic or international audience, it really pulls from the same core design toolkit. So the same fundamentals of usability design generally remain true. However, when you're designing for a global product like Disney Plus, approaching design with a global mindset really means being inclusive of everyone around the world equally. So doing so means considering the full impact to the core experience with every new launch and with every new feature enhancement. The approach during the discovery phase leans into principles of cross-cultural and inclusive design. And, we need to understand, to Mave's point, who we're serving, what matters to them, the conditions in which they'll be using the service, so that we can really ensure that as we're going through the design process, any of our internal biases are removed from that equation. At the same time, what we really need to understand is we need to think about how we can scale those design decisions. And that's really where the approach of designing for a single market starts to differ. So it's really critical to plan for the unknown. And there's a lot of difficulties and complexities there, but it's critical to avoid any fixed solutions. With the Disney Plus international launches, what I found most important to consider at the onset was scalability and flexibility, not only when defining the experience, but also, and importantly, when we were thinking about the process that we needed to use, the tools and the resources that we invested in. Fundamentally, that really set us up to go broad with the global features and continues to set us up accordingly. But it also allows us to go deep when we identify those opportunities through research and through the data that we're gathering to really understand what the opportunities are to differentiate for region-specific design decisions and features.
Yeah, that's really great. I think, and with those core design and research elements, it's also about, the nuances of what our product really is, and hand in hand with that is the content. So Connie, the international launches can be challenging. Can you talk to us a little bit about, from the content side of things, what challenges your team has faced when we're launching to a different country or region?
Thanks, Rebekah. Certainly for us, it was handling a huge volume of titles and assets from prep to delivery in a very truncated amount of time, with, of course, finite human and technical resources. Just to give a sense of volume, for a typical territory launch, we've delivered over 500,000 assets, various things to do with video and artwork, metadata, and all of the localized versions of each of those, subtitles, dubbed audio. Not to say that there was that many titles, it's just, of course, every title has many, many elements that need to deliver through the pipeline to go live successfully. So that really was the biggest challenge for us. And because we're a nascent supply chain, and team overall. Like our content management systems and tool sets are just not in a mature state right now. And a lot of it, sure, was built on the backbone of existing business lines, to support theatrical or electronic sell-through or broadcast or what have you. So a lot of that then I think just caused challenges just to deliver that amount of volume at scale. So really we just used our scrappy startup instincts, to think about how do we do these things differently? How do we, stand up really quick solutions? And sure, we collaborated with tech teams to do so, and we still got it done. I think also the other, not challenge, I think it was really exciting opportunity was to partner with the in-territory teams. We're lucky to have them, spread across the globe at Disney. And, I think it was really important for us to adjust workflows and really identify roles and responsibilities between globally centrally located teams here, mostly in LA or New York, as well as the ones in territory. We do still manage everything through a central delivery pipeline, but it was really critical to identify, well, exactly who will do what, at every point along the way, just to make sure we set it up properly. And along those lines of, what it takes really to kind of be successful at these international launches. Rebekah, I wanted to throw the question back to you. What are the key skills, in your opinion, needed for a product manager working on these international launches?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question. I certainly had a unique and great opportunity when I first started back almost 2 years ago. I was the first member of the team on the product team for international. So I was building out that team. It was one woman show for a little bit. Now we're like over 30 people. It's pretty nuts. But I had to think really deeply about what those skills and culture was for the team as you're growing something so quickly and you're crafting that. So I certainly had to think about it in past roles, but this one, it was really critical for something net new. And I think, you mentioned partnering with the regional teams. That's frankly one of my favorite parts of my job. In 1 hour, I may be talking to folks in APAC, and the other I'm talking to folks, in EMEA, in their EMEA team or the LATAM team, and I get to jump around the world in all these conversations. But what comes with that is you really need the ability to adjust your narrative for a variety of audiences. I think a lot of folks think about it with levels or different functions, but it's also cultures. I think there's a difference when you're working with, say, an office that may be multicultural than, say, that office is working with another office that's in a given country and may be more made up of folks from that country. And that can change how you speak to folks. It can change, little things like how people bring up conflict or how people show disagreement, and that can make or break a project. And so you really need to be able to adjust and partner and think about that. And what comes in hand with that is, while also important for all product roles, in my opinion, is a deep emotional intelligence. It is so critical. It's really important for a global landscape. I think it's important to understand with that the desire and ability to check biases. I know we all have talked about it, I know, a lot in our working day, but we all have them. And most product managers or folks who have worked on a purely domestic product, whatever country that may be, don't realize all the little details that go into what you inherently know from a product that you're building. And that goes away when you're bringing a product to another culture, and you need to be able to really sit with that. And I think, one of my favorite quotes that I always get wrong, and I can't ever remember who it is, but it's, intelligence is understanding how truly ignorant you are. And basically understanding like really what you don't know that you don't know. And I think that's really important in this role because you're constantly learning, and you have to be comfortable with that and comfortable with, just a variety of people. So that's a really great question. I'm glad you asked that, which lines into also our process. So you take those skills, which are really important for all of our functions, right? But then into process. So like Susana, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about, what are the key elements of your process when you're designing a product, for an international launch?
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you asked that because, what you mentioned about not knowing what you don't know is something that I'd love to touch on. And, with the design process, the way that I think about it, there's essentially two pillars. So there's the discovery aspect, and there's also the systems aspect. In the early design discovery phase, so speaking about that first pillar, close partnership with UXR to really establish that clear understanding of our users. Again, what's important to them, the context in which they're experiencing the product is a critical part of the process. And it's especially critical for international launches, since to the point, there's a lot of unknowns that we might take for granted when designing a domestic product. Just these implied understandings of the context that you're in. For example, there is likely a level of familiarity with the language, the cultural and the social norms. So investing more deeply in that discovery process really early is critical to identify those gaps in understanding and essentially, ideally, mitigate the risk as early as possible. In parallel, a really close partnership with product to understand, what is table stakes for launching in a particular region. Here's where we really get into the requirements. It's a huge and fundamental part of the process, understanding those, early on in that discovery process. The requirements such as regional legal compliance, which you're very familiar with, language support, localization, things like data formatting and new payment integrations. And those are just to name a few. But planning for those requirements really means, planning for what you don't know and avoiding a fixed approach to the UI so that you don't paint yourself into a corner that you then have to retroactively adjust. On the point of the language support, actually, an example that might not be as obvious or perhaps overlooked without the early discovery is considering a dynamic font strategy for a global product. For a domestic product, you might have a fixed approach to that where some elements are considered to be true and concrete. But for a global product, you really want to strip out anything that is fixed and allow for that scalability in the system. So, establishing and socializing those systems for the design process to scale is really critical. And the end-to-end design process for developing the international product or an international product, in case it isn't clear, it's very logistically complex. So, because of this, some of the key activities that the design team thinks through or has to consider are things like desk research, competitive audits, testing builds. Again, that might seem like table stakes and quite obvious, but for testing an international or doing those activities for an international or global audience, we need more planning. It needs longer lead times, oftentimes creative problem solving when accessing tools and other resources that might be very readily available domestically. So again, another example of that for translations, if they're not yet available, one of the approaches that we take in defining the UI is using something like pseudo-localization so that we can test early and incorporate that into the solutions to really ensure that the UI scales. And that's very much in close collaboration, again, with your team, with our localization partners. And once we have the final translations, we're really able to validate using those builds that can be configured by language to do that sort of design localization testing. That's, again, it's something that maybe might not be as obvious, but it's a really critical part of our process to ensure it's a usable product and desirable.
Yeah, I love those examples that you gave. I think especially the font and the spacing, it's one of those moments, it's one of those biases, right? Like you don't realize when you're looking at a screen that you're looking in your language and all of the things that are hidden behind that have to be done. And yeah, fonts have to be different, right? Languages are different, alphabets are different. It's such a great example. I want to shift the conversation a little bit to talk, we've got a ton of product managers watching us or aspiring product managers. We've touched on this a little bit in previous questions. Connie, I'd love for you to shine a light on, how best product teams can partner with an operations team like yourself in content operations.
Sure. So once we hear about a prospective territory launch, at least for Disney Plus, like our first action is really, well, what content do we want to put there? So our team really is one of the very early teams to be in touch with the business teams in territory to really discuss, what is that content scope going to look like? Do you want, for instance, videos that were actually tailored to that market? not just from like a subtitle and dubbing perspective, but perhaps there was a scene that was actually edited to show, soccer instead of hockey, because that's just more relevant in that market. So things to do with video localizations as well as title treatments. Do you want to keep those in English in your market because that's how it's known in the audience, or do you want to localize it into your language, as well as other metadata needs? So we have those very early conversations. I think my big note for any product team, developing new features or functionality for the product itself is to engage as early as you can with a content ops team, because we are super intimately, have a deep understanding of the content itself, the creative intentions behind the content, as well as, we do know what the business priorities and strategies are for a territory, since we're in touch with those teams very early on, as well as having, of course, the bread and butter of understanding the content supply chain and the very technical details about how to get that wonderful, beautiful piece of art onto the service so consumers can watch. So I know, teams tend to think of ops kind of on the tail end just because we're delivering things, but I think it only behooves and kind of improves the experience of collaborating together on new product features early on. An example I can actually give that we experienced recently was with our February launch of a ton of star content, as well as our Singapore launch. We had also released parental controls across the app. And, that did require a lot of collaboration on metadata, because ratings is a big part of driving how that works. I think, it could have been improved, I think, next time if we were brought in earlier in the conversation, just to make that whole process smoother. I mean, we pulled it together at the end of the day, but I think, just closer collaboration earlier, I think could have prevented some surprises that we all sort of experienced.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a theme there, product managers. Make sure you are co-creating with your cross-functional teams early and often. You never know what you're going to uncover. So along those lines, for another early team, Mave, I'm curious, what is the best way for product managers to partner with UX research? And if it's unique for international markets, please let me know. But also, I'm curious, any moments when it didn't work, and what was the impact?
That is another great question. And my answer is going to be similar to something Connie just said, which is to engage with us early and often, and probably before you even think it's necessary. And I think sometimes, UX research is thought of as just usability. So people tend to think of it as, oh, let me go to Mave's team when it's time to test something. Not something I really experienced working with you lovely ladies. But sometimes that does happen where people kind of frame research as, oh, let me go check out this thing that I've already created and see, what people think about it. And yes, we can do that. However, there's also strategic research that we do that can help the business understand needs that people have that lead to opportunities for us to innovate in, or even validate or see if there's a there for some of the ideas that people actually have, right? Before we do all of this design and development work, why don't we see if there's actually something here first? And within international markets, that's even more critical, because even when you're thinking about that at the beginning and you think, let me pull in my research team, it's still going to take that team time because of the logistics of recruiting international participants, which is one of the things that actually keeps me up at night. Actually, there's a current situation keeping me up just a little bit, because it's really, really hard finding a consistent and reliable stable of vendors that can help you recruit for research. And for us, for my team, we do a lot of our research ourselves because we have a really great team, if I must say so. But also because we do our research in a specific way and we're looking for specific kinds of methods and people who are expert at certain kinds of methods, specifically ethnographic research. And sometimes vendors don't quite do it the way that we would do it. And so that means we have to do it ourselves, but we need participants, and that can take a really long time. So one time that didn't work out so well was when we were testing some designs in the Nordic region. And it took a month for our test to close because of lack of a good recruiting vendor to kind of close it faster. And so that's something that I've had to learn quite a bit from. And we've learned a ton since we've started, but our international recruiting, it's still not perfect yet. We're still working on it. But speaking of key learnings, goodness, I have a question for Rebekah, which is, what are the key learnings from your perspective for international expansions? Any mistakes you want to talk about?
Oh, yes. I think it's so funny. If there's any product person out there that doesn't think they make mistakes, I have got news for you. I think I've done a few, rounds of global launches, and each time it's better than the last because inevitably there are just minefields of mistakes I have made or my team has made. And so they're learning opportunities. And so you should get comfortable with that because it helps you be a better product person, a better partner, better leader. And so I think the biggest one I think is really critical, right? Because my team's comprised, it's multifunctional. It's got product, it's got for global expansion, it's got internationalization, which is a technical product, skill, and localization, right? Comprised of language managers and project managers, what have you. And so I think, when you're thinking about all of those elements that feed into product for a global product, is you need to build scale into whatever you do. You can frankly never have enough scale, and it'll be the biggest hurdle that you will face as you expand further and further. I think a lot of times we talk about tech debt in our work. I think we talk less about operational debt, design debt, product debt, and process debt. And I think it's really just as critical because it can slow you down. And I mean, honestly, launching into 5 countries, 10 countries, 40 countries, is not the same each time. And it's very different. And you have to reinvent when you're building for, say, 5 countries versus, 100 plus countries. The way you do product, the way you design, everything is different. And so you need to think about that. And I think a lot of times teams will think, oh, we've launched in a certain amount of countries, we're global, we totally understand that. And that's a lot of what you don't know. That's that bias that you got to check because inevitably you're leaving something out and you really need to reflect on that. So I think that's really one big critical one. I'd also say, I'm fortunate that localization is part of my team. That was a decision we made a few months after I joined, and I never want it to be different, I think. And I know the team feels very similarly because you want to keep your localization teams close and embed, or at least embedded in your product teams. I think a lot of times localization can be an adjacent team. It's thought of as very transactional. Like a vendor that you need to work with on an ad hoc product basis. And that is absolutely the wrong way to be dealing with localization. You need those language managers, those experts, whether it's in, traditional Chinese, Arabic, German, whatever it may be. You need them in that early conversation every step of the way, because there are so many times where we've had to unwork efforts that other teams have done because they weren't considering that effort, the effort as it relates to translating to other languages, as much as they should have. And I think it's just, if you treat localization as an afterthought, it will harm your customer experience and it will harm your brand. That's not like a maybe, that's an if, or not if, it's like it will happen. There's so many examples of that. And I think there's, further examples with, there's always small, medium, big. For small, just going alongside the localization piece, you need to think deeply when you're wondering if you're going to localize your branded feature names. Those product managers out there, I know maybe you and your product marketing team or whoever it is thought you created the most catchy name that ever existed. Likely either in your original language, or if it's English, standard business language, like whatever it may be, I can guarantee you it will not resonate the same as it does in English. A lot of things don't translate or just won't understand. And so then you're left with a situation where you have an audience who doesn't understand what this feature is. Maybe that icon isn't even universally recognized. And so they're not going to engage with it. You're going to get false data. And that's just a small thing you can do. So there's a lot of bigger mistakes. I know we're going to have a Q&A later that we can certainly answer more questions, but there are tons of stuff that you can do. And if you don't have a localization team that includes, like, say, a language manager or country teams, to work with, it's a UX research or product marketing research exercise, right? There are ways to accomplish it without a fully deep team. It just means that you need to really be thinking about that. So I want to end on some final pieces of advice for the product teams from our cross-functional leaders here. I want our audience to walk out of this realizing, like, what is that one last piece that I really wanted to know if I want to work in international, or if I want to be better at it if I'm already in it and starting my career. So let's start with Susana. Susana, what final advice do you have for our product managers?
Sure. Yeah. It actually hinges on what you just said, which really resonates with me. And I think there's a theme in, how we've been thinking about the questions that we've all received. But fundamentally, to create an inclusive, authentic, and meaningful experience for a global audience, it's really important to avoid approaching it as a retrofit of the experience to suit new audiences. You don't want to be reactive. You don't want to think about how you can then, essentially jam an experience that really needs to be considered on its own and as part of the solution. So, really establishing a plan that considers that expansion and extensibility is key. On the point that you made, something like idioms, local idioms that, have a certain meaning for us, just thinking about that and trying to be as understanding of how you may scale in the future is something that I would definitely advise strongly.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Mave, what are your final words of wisdom?
I would say, and I'm going to piggyback just a little bit on what Susana said, but you want to leave your assumptions at the door. Confirmation bias, when we kind of take in only what confirms our own bias, it happens already in product design, and creating new products for people. But it can happen a lot worse in expanding to global markets, because this is something you're doing over and over again. It's really easy to think that you've got everything down and not to approach each new territory as its own special thing, and kind of starting with zero assumptions and allowing the information and stories and narratives from, these, the people that you're designing for to fill what you know. And so that's what I would say is just, you want to check your bias. A way to check your bias is to abandon your assumptions.
Yeah, that's great. Connie, do you have any, brief final words of wisdom for us?
Sure. It's more to do around communication, but it's similar themes where, particularly in communicating to, internal teams that may be located in territory where you need their valuable feedback. Don't take silence as agreement. Listen well, ask many more questions than you would in someone who speaks in the native, language that you speak. I think it's really around just nuanced communication, being respectful, being educated, not even speaking so fast, things like that. And so I think that also really can, if you have that down up front, then it can, lead to sort of faster agreement and kind of faster movement versus slowing things down.
All right. Well, thank you, ladies, for that wonderful advice and join us today. We'll see everyone in the Q&A later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mallika, Rebekah, Mave, Susana, Connie, and to all of you who have joined us today. Did you enjoy this as much as I did? Connect with our speakers in our follow-up interactive sessions later today. Check the agenda for more details. Stop by Virtual Selfie Station at 21 WIP app to snap your selfie and share it to the group mural. While you're there, grab your Women in Product swag at the WIP swag store. All documents, slides, and resources will be available in the 21 WIP app at the close of the day. Thank you again for joining us.